So this is a reminder to all members of the public that's participating in our virtual meeting that if you'd like to speak on a particular item during public comment period, please click on the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen. You'll be prompted to speak up to 3 minutes when it's your turn. And for those participating by telephone, please press *9 to request to speak. Thank you for your participation.
Do we want to give it a couple minutes just in case other people are joining, other committee members, or do you think we should get started? So we're missing Kate, Sarah, and Allison.
Can someone just give them a phone call?
I think Sarah just joined as an attendee.
Oh. Perfect.
Hi, Sarah. Do you want to test to make sure your volume works?
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. Also, should we change? I'm going to change Sarah's name. Eric, I'll leave it up to you if you want to get started or wait a couple minutes. Uh-oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I would say let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, great.
Remind me of what we need for a quorum.
4 members, so we have 5.
Okay.
All right. I'm gonna go through roll call. Committee member Breeding is not yet here. Committee member Choi?
Here.
Committee member Cooper?
Here.
Vice Chair Martin is not yet here. Committee member Peterson?
Here.
Committee member Way?
Here.
Chair Larson?
Here.
Awesome.
Welcome everybody. Glad we could get together and have our Climate Action Committee meeting again. Just a reminder for the committee members that when we're into discussions that we're going to raise our hand when you want to speak, and I'll recognize you so that you can talk and unmute yourself. Otherwise, if you can mute yourself. And so let's see, agenda. All right. So Lizzie, can we have the approval of the minutes?
You should have all received the minutes in the email I sent on Friday. If anyone has any edits or anything they want to bring up, if not, we can approve them with a roll call vote.
Yeah, I had a couple. I don't know if anybody else does.
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay. On the progress of the...
Uh-oh, Nick, you are muted.
Yeah, the problem is I'm going to be jumping between applications. Like I have this up in Adobe Acrobat. So when I go to Adobe Acrobat, then I am not in Zoom anymore. So sorry about that, but single screen has its limitations on this. So when we had talked about the status of where we are with the CAAP, I think there was a presentation on that. I had asked that there would be some sort of tracking document that would show we could look at, that was available for committee members to look at to see where we're at, what's sort of being checked off or what's where. And I think you guys are doing that. It was just making aware of where that is.
We have a staff document that we're using to track implementation, and our plan was to bring implementation updates to the Climate Action Committee quarterly, but we don't currently have any kind of CAAP implementation dashboard available to the community.
I wasn't thinking to the community, I was thinking for committee members.
We will bring that CAAP implementation plan as a quarterly update to the committee, but it won't be open for public 24/7, just because it's a working staff document and we kind of need to be able to look at it and address it and, you know, work through it as needed.
And so that's in our information that's given to us quarterly, right? So when we get to that meeting, we'll have a copy of that.
We haven't really worked out what the next quarterly update will look like, but yes, we'll be bringing CAAP implementation updates, which will likely include bringing up that CAAP implementation spreadsheet, either sending a copy ahead of time or putting it up for everyone to see.
Okay, that's great. So that was just one, you know, under that category was the comment I had made that we would get that. The other thing was under presentations. I know we didn't have one last time, but we had talked about having CAAP related presentations, potentially asking other municipalities who are sort of further along on their process, and then also presenters relative to, you know, the 3 categories that we're pursuing if needed.
So I think that's like more like future agenda items, right? It wasn't, there was no presentation.
I didn't want to lose that we had, I mean, right now there's nothing, and then we'll see it again until it's too late to add anything. So it would be kind of nice to sort of be mindful that we may want some presentations about those things. Keep that, so we discuss that.
So are you suggesting, do you want me to edit these minutes to reflect that, or should we maybe just include that as a future agenda item for this meeting?
Well, I was sort of, I just want to keep it, however, whatever is the easiest way to keep it on the table. I mean, this is past minutes, so I don't really care. But I went back and looked at my minutes, and a comment had been made about, you know, what kind of presentations should we be planning for. And I think we need to still keep that in mind.
So maybe we can include that in today's minutes when we get to that part of the agenda. Any other comments? All right, I move to approve the minutes.
Okay,
I second.
perfect. Now we're going to do a roll call vote. So as a reminder, everyone, I will call on your name. Make sure to unmute yourself to say aye or no or nay. All right. Committee member Breeding, is she here yet? Don't see her. Committee member Choi.
Aye.
Committee member Cooper.
Aye.
Vice Chair Martin, if she's here. Committee member Peterson.
Aye.
Committee member Way.
Aye.
Chair Larson.
Aye.
Fantastic. The minutes are approved.
Okay, so we have time for public comment. So if anybody from the public wants to comment on anything that's not on the agenda, so this would be the time that you could speak, and we can hear what you have to say. If it's an agenda item, then we'd ask that you wait for the agenda item, and then you'll have time to talk on that item.
And then, Eric, if it's okay with you, I'm going to quickly read the reminder that Anne read at the beginning of the meeting, just to remind people how to submit their public comment.
Okay.
Just because it's a little bit different. Let's see. To comment via the video conference, so if you're logged in on Zoom right now, click the raise your hand button to request to speak when public comment is being taken. So now, you will then be unmuted when it is your turn to make your comment for up to 3 minutes. After the allotted time, you will be remuted. Instructions on how to raise your hand is available on the agenda on our city website if you need to take a look at that. To comment by phone, you will be prompted to raise your hand by pressing *9 to request to speak when public comment is being taken on the agenda item. You will then be unmuted when it is your turn to make your comment for up to 3 minutes. You will be remuted after the allotted time. Perfect. I don't see any raised hands. We'll make one more call for people to raise their hands or press *9 if you'd like to make public comment. Seeing none.
Okay. So we can move on to the next agenda item, which is announcements. So Lizzie, you want to take it away with announcements?
Yes. Okay. So everyone should see Claire's screen with a slide that says announcements on it. If you do not see it, please unmute yourself and let us know. Looks like everyone can see it. Perfect. Okay, Claire, next slide. So we wanted to give you all a quick update of what the city has been up to during this COVID-19 pandemic and the shelter in place. And also thank you for your patience and understanding as we work through this challenge to transition to virtual work and also changing our city operations during this public health emergency. As many of you know, most of our city operations have shifted to remote. Most of our staff is now, a portion of our staff is now working remotely. Some are still working in person to provide critical services and deliver meals and such. But the day-to-day roles of many of our staff, including Claire and myself, have shifted dramatically to focus on concurrent disaster response and recovery. This will likely continue throughout the duration of the COVID-19 emergency, so staff has really had to be flexible and adaptive given everything or to respond to the day-to-day changes. A quick, some more information about how that works with the city. Our city council declared a local emergency on March 16th. And doing so effectively opened and activated our Emergency Operations Center, our EOC, and us staff have been assigned different roles within the EOC and the branches of the EOC. Those 4 branches are operations, logistics, planning, and finance. There's also a public information component and economic development. Claire is the city's public information officer, so her role has largely shifted to managing public information, and I've been helping her with some of that, same with Michelle and Bianca. And if you want to know more about the city's COVID-19 response, I encourage you to check out albanyca.org/COVID-19, and from there you'll be able to see all our subpages with information on the virus and different programs available. Next slide. That being said, we're very thankful that we've still been able to pursue CAAP implementation and sustainability initiatives during this time. Bianca and Michelle have been instrumental in making sure our projects are moving forward, meeting with subcommittees, continuing research on write-ups, and so we're very thankful for that. So a quick update about some of the projects we've been working on the last couple months from home. The green building update. The building electrification subcommittee has been meeting over Zoom, and they'll be sharing a more in-depth update of their work later on in the meeting. Same with the electric vehicle action plan. The EV action subcommittee has been meeting over Zoom, and we'll be sharing an update of their efforts to date later in the meeting. Bianca has been working on a draft of a new sustainable procurement policy for the city, which will create a pathway for more sustainable municipal procurement. And once she finalizes this policy, she will work with key staff to train and implement to make sure that we're making more sustainable municipal purchases. Exciting news, we are going to be working with an intern from UC Berkeley starting next week. Next week or the week after?
Yeah, next week, yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Bianca. His name is Joshua, and he will be working with us remotely to create a user-friendly home electrification resource hub on our webpage, which will also include information on electric vehicle charging. So this is going to help people who have questions about how to electrify their home get through each step to see what they have to do to set it up and to achieve the goal. We've also continued our ongoing online and virtual sustainability programming and outreach. So we've still been attending our sustainability meetings with other Alameda County jurisdictions to discuss how to effectively prioritize sustainability during the shelter-in-place and COVID-19 pandemic, and also how to think about sustainability moving forward. And we continue to conduct regular sustainability programming and outreach. Next slide. Specifically, some of that programming and outreach that happened during this shelter-in-place was our online Earth Day. As many of you know, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day was on April 22nd. And although many of our online Earth Day, our in-person Earth Day activities had to be postponed, including our compost giveaway and our shoreline cleanup, staff partnered with the Watershed Project to bring 2020 Earth Day activities online so that we could make sure our community could still celebrate the earth and nature and everything our world has to offer, but from the safety of their own home or neighborhood. Specifically with Earth Day, we gathered resources from other agencies and organizations, including the Watershed Project, who we partnered with, the Clean Water Program, NASA, and many more who had online Earth Day activities, and we compiled them all on albanyca.org/earthday. And in addition to that, we included information on forming sustainable habits during the shelter-in-place, and we released an Earth Day special edition e-news newsletter. Our e-news goes out to about 6,000 people, so hopefully that was well read and well enjoyed by everyone who opened it. And information in that newsletter included tips on low carbon, low waste cooking, tips for gardening and the importance of compost from Stop Waste, resources for energy reduction, home retrofits, and available rebates from Bayren. And other things included history of Earth Day and the environmental justice movement. And Michelle also included, you may have seen, some homemade recipes and information about how to mend clothes instead of buying new and create cloth napkins. So we got some positive feedback on that Earth Day newsletter, so we were very excited about it. I hope you all read it. Those were all in one, my 2 announcements. Let me know if anyone has any questions.
Great. It's really wonderful that you all are been able to accomplish so much given everything else going on. And great. Congratulations. Thank you for doing all that. Appreciate it.
We have a raised hand from a member of the public as well.
Hi there, this is Preston. Nice to see you all. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. In these strange times, as I say, nice to see all your faces again, even though you can't see mine as far as I know. This may be a random spot to ask this, and so if it's not appropriate, certainly respond that way, but the mayor announced a few meetings ago, and I apologize, I'm a little out of breath. I'm taking advantage of these strange times to work out while I'm watching the meeting of all things. And he announced that Waste Management is dumping all the recycling in the landfill now. I am curious to know more about that if there is any available information. Thank you. And I trust you'll put me back on mute so you don't have to listen to me panting away.
I'll go ahead and do that now.
Claire, I can answer that unless you'd like to. Okay. Yes, Waste Management gave us a notice of force majeure. I wasn't prepared to answer that though, so sorry, I don't know the exact date that was, but that was in March, shortly after the Bay Area shelter-in-place order was ordered. And for those who don't know what a notice of force majeure was, because I wasn't super familiar with it before that, it's basically just a notice saying that they may not be able to meet all the obligations listed in the contract that they have with the city, which most of the services they provide are outlined and bound by our city's franchise agreement contract. So due to that notice of force majeure and some of their operations being affected by the COVID-19 crisis and having drivers become sick or need to take time off, they temporarily suspended processing of commercial recycling and commercial organics, but residential recycling and residential organics were never affected. So those continue to be processed and to date continue to be processed. And 2 weeks ago, it was actually just after that council meeting, about a week after, they alerted us that commercial organics and commercial recyclables will again be processed. They've started being processed as of now. Claire, did I miss anything? Okay, great. But yes, recycling is now being recycled again and compost is being composted. So we're very excited about that.
It looks like Preston has re-raised his hand here. Unmute him again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for letting me comment again. I have to say that the mayor's announcement caused a change in behavior in my home. For reasons I won't go into, getting recycling and waste separated has been problematic here. So the mayor did not explain that this only affected commercial and not everything. If I recall correctly, I could be wrong. Recollection is faulty. But it might be useful for those few or many who heard it to put out an announcement in e-news, just reinforcing that, because I will reestablish better practices here where I live. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for those updates. I, like Tom, appreciate all that you guys have been doing. It's really impressive, and it's been nice to be working on the subcommittees, keeping traction with that stuff. So, all right. So we have a presentation. So Claire's going to do that. Is that right?
That's me. I'm
All right.
pulling up the slides now.
Okay.
All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. All right, good evening, everyone. Staff back when we were planning for the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, we worked with our consultants from Cascadia and from BAE during the planning process to identify actions in the CAAP, in the draft CAAP, that would require funding. And BAE in particular, we paid them to do a financial analysis to just determine creative ways to fund the CAAP and ensure that the actions that we were proposing to council were things that we would be able to obtain funding for. So that's a process that we did last fall. And now that the CAAP is in its final form and we're beginning to implement short-term actions in the short term, we want to have a conversation with the committee about what long-term funding looks like for this CAAP, because there are some items that have been identified, particularly incentives and capital projects that are going to be very expensive. So that's the purpose of this presentation. successful implementation of the first climate action plan resulted in a 33% reduction in emissions from 2004 to 2018. And those actions were funded by a variety of sources, including partnerships with regional agencies, utilities, and nearby cities to administer a variety of conservation-focused education and incentive programs. That's kind of the biggest success we felt like we had was through those partnerships. Grants from government agencies, from utilities, and large nonprofits to fund planning and also major infrastructure projects. We capitalize on special funds for waste reduction, stormwater, and transportation to provide programs and matching funds for infrastructure grants. And the city's general fund did support the CAAP administration of the CAAP with staff time and funding for technical consultants, as well as paying for half of the new CAAP. So we have been able to capitalize on available funding, but we want to kind of look long-term at this new CAAP and what it might look like. So staff is tasked with implementing the new CAAP, and based on the factors listed on this slide and input from the committee, staff has identified items for short-term implementation beginning this year, as well as priority long-term projects. So I'm going to go through those really quickly. Staff has begun implementing short-term actions in the CAAP, such as initial planning, policy changes, and outreach programs. Lizzie mentioned some of the things we've been working on in the past few months. These projects are primarily funded through in-kind staff time as well as regional partnerships. We do have technical consulting available to us through BCE and through Stop Waste, so we've capitalized on that. Staff is currently pursuing outside grant funding for larger planning projects that necessitate technical consulting services. And in terms of long-term projects, such as incentives for electrification of homes and vehicles, as well as capital improvements, will require additional funding. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because both of these charts or tables were in your memo. But from this list, we've identified this list of items that need additional funding. Much of this can come through regional partnerships and from grants, but these initiatives will be more successful if we identify dedicated climate funds. The largest sort of big ticket items that we've discussed here would be the incentives and then these capital projects. So that's what we're looking at. When we're discussing funding, it's important to note that we're currently in a health crisis, which is also turned into an economic crisis. I know Lizzie talked a little bit about what that means for the city, but we haven't really talked about what that means for our budgets. The city's Emergency Operations Center is activated and priorities and services have shifted. We're also experiencing we were experiencing a budget deficit before this. So we were already having a challenge to balance the budget. And we anticipate a significant reduction in tax revenue due to the shelter-in-place order and the pandemic, as many cities have. We don't know quite what that looks like yet, but we know it's going to be significant. In the short term, staff plans to leverage staff time and partnerships like we did with the last CAAP, pursue grants, and utilize available resources such as special funds to implement CAAP actions identified in our 2020 work plan, while continuing to work toward identifying funding for those long-term high priority projects. So we have to be frugal and strategic currently, while still looking for the long term, while we will need to identify funding. Before discussing potential CAAP funding sources, I want to back up a little bit and just do a little bit of background on city finances, because we haven't really talked about this in this venue before, and I think it's helpful for everyone to have some background. The Finance Administrative Services Department in the city monitors the fiscal operations of the city and addresses long-term financial operations by developing 5-year revenue and expenditure forecasts, mid-year budget review and revisions, general budgetary oversight and control, along with capital improvement projects, such as lighting and landscaping, streets, sewer, and facilities. This chart indicates the percentage of revenue received from each source. In last fiscal year, the city received $32 million in revenue from these sources, primarily property tax, sales tax, and franchise and other taxes are the biggest bulk of the items of the revenue for the city. The city council decides how those revenues are allocated. And I think it's important to note that even though the city of Albany is very small, we are a full service municipality. That's relatively rare for cities of our size. Many of them contract out for services like fire, but we have our own. So we have a full service police department with patrol, investigation, and administrative services. It's not uncommon for that to take a large chunk of a city's revenue. In other cities, it's often more. We have an all-risk fire department, including fire, rescue response, paramedic ambulance services, and hazardous materials response. Public Works Department, which manages sanitary sewer, storm drain, and public park maintenance and upgrades. A lot of the projects they're working on currently are very expensive and also mandated. How they're working on regulatory mandates like sewer upgrades. So there's not a lot of flexibility in some of the funding that goes to those projects. Our Recreation and Community Services Department provides adult programs, senior centers, teen center programs, childcare, and right now they've shifted to an online virtual rec center, which I recommend that you check out. And our administrative department, that general government category in that chart, is primarily our administration department, which is categorized, is responsible for managing policy implementation and management of the day-to-day operations of the city. That includes the city clerk, information technology, public information, neighborhood services, human resources. And then last but not least, our community development department, which is where sustainability lives, is responsible for providing land use, transportation, economic development, environmental planning, and building and code enforcement services. So balancing the budget can be a struggle because all of these departments are providing really critical services. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on that. There are many potential funding mechanisms available in the public sector. And like I mentioned, staff worked with Cascadia and BAE to determine which funding sources would be most appropriate for implementation of this CAAP. And we've only highlighted a few potential funding mechanisms here because those are the things that were identified as the most feasible and the most logical for the work that we're doing. The city council could adopt a budget policy that prioritizes setting aside funding from the general fund to be used for climate action work. That's one option. The city council could adopt a climate reserve fund policy, which could be related to the above item. They could be one and the same, where we set aside funding for capital projects and also set up a way where there's savings from energy efficiency projects that are placed back into that fund for future projects, so we could capitalize on those potential cost savings. Fees for service could be identified. That can be tricky because they have to be justified and they have to be used in a certain way. And then special taxes are another option. Like I mentioned, they're things that we've capitalized on in the past, and we have some available to us for CAAP funding, just like we funded the first CAAP. In your memo, there's a list of the taxes that we have, special taxes that we have used to benefit our CAAP implementation. In terms of passing a new special tax, it is tricky because it requires 2/3 vote approval and it must be used for a specific purpose. So in the past, council's been less inclined to put those on the ballot because of the difficulty in getting them passed and also the limitations that it sets on funding. People tend to like flexible funding for times like these where we have to be flexible. So those are the potential funding sources that we're looking at. And it's also important to consider factors when discussing public finance, such as the costs and benefits of a tax, or a fee should be spread as equitably as possible. Whenever possible, implementing actions should generate long-term cost savings that will repay and even generate return on investment. It's important to leverage available resources such as those available from regional partnerships and grants rather than raising taxes whenever possible. So we try to do that first before we just go to the voters. And then funded projects and programs need to be designed to be able to be sustained over time. So given all that information, we have a proposal. At their meeting on Monday, the City Council continued their ongoing discussion to consider potential ballot measures for the November 2020 ballot. And they are interested in pursuing a general tax increase on various utilities, which we're calling UUT. And they're interested in structuring the tax increase based on a recommendation made by the Albany Climate Action Coalition, known as ACAC. So staff's going to bring that proposal back to them with ballot language in June for them to vote to put it on the ballot. But it sounds like there's already been a proposal by climate advocates that council's interested in pursuing. The item as drafted and the item that went out as part of the voter poll that our consultants conducted in March states that the tax is needed to pay for several key city programs. One of those programs is environmental services. So it was already in the plan to have this general tax, a portion of it go to climate work. Our recommendation is to recommend that council continue to pursue this general tax, which has more likelihood to pass than a special tax. And then request that they create a budget policy to prioritize some of that general tax funding to be set aside for CAAP implementation once the city's budget deficit has been addressed. I don't know that we can ask them to do that right away, but certainly I think they could set a policy soon that once the city's deficit has been addressed, they will prioritize CAAP funding from that tax measure. Or if for some reason it doesn't pass, find it anyway. I think my sense is that our council is interested in funding CAAP implementation. So I'm hoping that this tax measure is our answer. So that's the presentation on funding. Maybe I'll stay on this slide with our proposal. Happy to answer any questions you have. And I don't know if you want to discuss a possible recommendation tonight or not. You don't have to. But if you do recommend something, it's something we could include in the staff report to council in June. Thank you.
How about if we start with questions and clarifications and that sort of thing? Nick?
Nick, you are muted.
Sorry, again, this toggling between apps. Should we just, I went through the whole report and I have a bunch of comments. I'm more than happy just to send my markup to staff. One thing I wanted to get clarified right now was ACAC did submit, actually I submitted it, a recommendation to the city council because actually all this was happening prior to coming to the Climate Action Committee, specifically addressing UUT. So I don't think the members of the committee here are even aware of what that is unless they read the ACAC letter. So I'm more than happy to present what the recommendation was. And I'm encouraged because I didn't quite get out of the city council meeting, that marathon 6-hour meeting, during the tax or the revenue generation analysis, and especially the UUT, whether they were just lightly considering what ACAC had recommended or whether they had indicated that they wanted to exactly follow what ACAC had proposed. So if you could provide a little more clarity on that, I could also give a brief outline of what ACAC had proposed to see that all members here are in keeping with that, because that actually came from the advocacy group. It didn't come from the Climate Action Committee.
Yeah, I'd be interested if it's relatively brief. Do you want to give a quick summary?
While I'm toggling back and forth between things,
Yeah.
Claire, if you could just maybe answer my question about whether City Council is taking that exact recommendation. I wasn't clear from the meeting last night.
They asked staff to bring back ballot language and to look into the difference that your proposal would have on projected revenues. So they didn't vote on anything specific, but my sense from the meeting was that they were implying their interest in pursuing that proposal, at least asking for more information so that they could make an informed decision, was how I took it.
Okay, great. Yeah,
But I
that's
think
what
it's
it
still
sounded
on the
like.
table.
Okay, so I'll read really quickly what I put in here. So ACAC presented an alternative proposal on the staff suggested UUT increases for bringing more funds into the general fund. Since the use of the UUT as a tool to incentivize residents to use less fossil fuel and to fund CAP goals was not reviewed by staff with CAC before establishing the parameters of the voter response poll, ACAC suggested the following increase in tax rate on natural gas and electricity. It suggested the following: increase the current tax rate on natural gas and electricity to 10% each, with a voter's recommendation that this increase be spent on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and with an eventual adjustment being made when possible to increase the tax rate on gas to a maximum of not more than 20% and to decrease the tax on electricity to a minimum of no less than 7% in a manner that is revenue neutral, which is critical to the city because the city wouldn't be changing how much tax they're collecting, just whether it came from gas or electricity. So it would still be the same amount of money. In tandem with this, ACAC requests no increase in the current 6.5% UUT on telecommunications, and ACAC agrees with the 7% UUT on water. This approach would raise slightly more revenue than currently proposed by staff. Being general fund revenue, there would be a tacit understanding that the funds from electricity and gas taxes exceeding those currently raised for the general fund would be used to further CAP goals. Or it actually, as Claire was saying, since it's total flexibility as general funds, if allowable, City Council could decide to commit even more funds out of those revenue sources to CAP goals.
I had okay, thanks, Nick. I had a question on the presentation about what, can you explain the Climate Reserve Fund a little bit more? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a new concept to us, so I breezed right by it. The idea is the council has other reserve funds for primarily for assets. So the idea is if you're going to buy, just an example is if you're going to buy an ambulance every 5 years instead of every year, then you have a fund where you put, you know, a fifth of the cost of the ambulance in this fund every year, so that you're saving up. It's a savings account, so that the budget, you're not budgeting this weird kind of thing like this. It feels a little bit more predictable, and you're saving up for those big purchases. So the idea of a climate reserve fund would be, it would probably be related to the budget policy where we'd say, okay, we have this fund where we have some money for CAP projects that we know are really large, like incentives or particularly capital projects. And then we can plan for, we can save up and plan for, hey, in 5 years, we're going to replace the HVAC system at City Hall, and so we need to save up for that because we're going to electrify. And then if there were to be efficiency savings from those improvements, we could find a way to make sure that those efficiency savings end up being included, so we can capitalize on those for any future projects. Does that make sense?
Tom? No.
I had a couple of questions. One thing that caught my eye in the report talking about the original CAP implementation, it mentioned that there was a subsidy for incentives. There was a section in there. I didn't even know that the city had that. How much do you have? I mean, I'm interested to know at some point how much we did give out as an added incentive, because it's interesting because we're talking about that going forward. So I didn't even know we were doing that.
Yeah, I think we mentioned it, but we kind of breezed by it. It was a short, well, it wasn't a short, it was a long-lived program, but there was a short period of time, maybe a year or maybe 2 years, where we had a grant. We had a grant where we partnered with other small cities in the region, and we actually got an EPA grant for CAP implementation, and there were a variety of programs from that, but one of them was matching grant funds for a program called Smart Lights, which unfortunately no longer exists for a variety of reasons. But they had a program where I walked door to door with them, like went door to door to every commercial establishment, every storefront in Albany, and offered to do all kinds of efficiency improvements, lighting, refrigeration, HVAC. And when we did the matching funds, we would actually usually pay for the entirety of the project, and even sometimes without matching funds, because they used PG&E's energy efficiency funds, they could pay. So
it was a commercial, non-residential.
It was a non-residential program.
Okay. The other question I had was, when we've worked on the UT in the past and come up with funding, the numbers we were coming up with was somewhere around $250,000 in that range. So I was curious why the amount that the city was talking about is so much more. Is that because it's a higher percent that they're increasing the UUT? Because I thought there was a limit on what you could do.
So they're increasing multiple utilities. So when the committee has discussed a UUT increase, it's been specifically for electricity and natural gas. But the council is looking at across the board increasing utilities and adding a tax on water, which currently doesn't exist but does in other cities. So that's been a conversation they've thought about for a long time. So that's why the revenue is so much more, is because they're increasing utilities across the board. That said, ACAC's request asks for less of an increase on telecommunications, and it sounds like council may be interested in moving forward with that. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what it'll look like, but it sounds like it'll generate a lot more revenue than this proposed special tax on just gas and electric would.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Hold on a sec, Nick. I think Sarah had a question, right?
I was just going back to the climate reserve fund. I was still kind of confused by that. So are we taking money from the general fund and then putting it into another reserve?
It can be used in different ways, but that's one way to use it. Yes, would be to take money from the general fund and put it into a specific fund that you only touch when you need it, like a savings account.
Great. Thanks. Okay, Nick?
yeah, I was just going to mention, Tom, the lion's share of that is the 7% on water is currently 0% tax. So now you have everybody in Albany paying 7%. And, you know, I mean, my water bill's about $60 a month. So all of a sudden, you know, 7% of whatever, you know, it adds up over the whole city. So that's where most of that generation came from. And then the increase they were saying was just going from, I think it's currently 7 for both electricity and gas, and they were suggesting only going to 8, just bumping it up a little bit. The ACAC is to go to 10 because we want to get us, I mean, we figure we'll never be able to go back and ask for another UUT increase, and then to put in this flexibility clause of being able to just, once PG&E allows this to happen, or the cities get together and figure out a way to help PG&E make this happen, start tweaking the percentages on the gas and the electricity to penalize gas and reduce it on electricity, but it would still come out to be the same amount of tax overall.
I had a quick, question about just sort of the general process for, you know, I haven't been in city government before. So if we have a large expenditure that we've identified in the climate action plan that we want the city council to address, what's the best way to make that case? How do we wait for them to allocate money to us, or do we make a case for a specific project, or what's a scenario for doing that?
I mean, it depends. We often go to city council to make a case on a specific project. Say we have, we want to focus on electric vehicle infrastructure. A lot of those bigger projects are through our capital improvement program. And council gets regular updates on those kinds of projects. And so we make a case for like where it fits in the priority and if it can get funding. But I think for this, a lot of the projects are things that we can figure out without going to council, because it just takes a little bit of consulting services or something else. So there's a lot of things that we can do without asking council directly, based on just us balancing our own budgets. But I think this conversation is I think it's an opportunity to go to council to say, we have these big ticket items that we've identified, and it would be great to have a funding source for them. And I think this, you know, our proposal that's up here on the screen is one option for that. But certainly there are other options. I don't know if that answered your question.
So Max, do you have a question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for the presentation, and thank you, Nick and Preston. I guess following up a little bit on that question, so looking at the pie chart, this is a question regarding the general fund and the allocation for the CAAP. Would you say that, is there a benchmarking that would say that, you know, Albany is within a ballpark of other cities such as Berkeley or Davis in terms of that orange or light yellow community development and environmental services? I'm just curious if that is a potential lever, because, you know, to support the CAAP, we are talking about very large first costs to like go to an electric vehicle, electric water heater, electric space heater, whatever it may be. There are a lot of costs, both commercially and residentially. And so this is a little bit anticipating the subcommittee updates, but I'm just wondering, you know, if that's a potential lever. That may be a very hard lever, because that's kind of potentially rebalancing the budget. But I was just curious how, you know, how you guys feel about that, and how Albany might benchmark with other cities.
It's a great question. It's really hard to say. We'd have to go do research on that. I mean, we could easily do research on it, but it's really hard to say, because climate action and sustainability are defined differently in every city, and they're in a different department in every city. And what Lizzie, Michelle, Bianca, and I do is different than other sustainability departments. And we actually much broader usually because we're such a small city. So it's really hard to say. But I think your question is, can we get more of the pie? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think we have to find strategic ways to figure out how to do that without taking away from any of these other things. How do we also have enough for our programs? And I think one of the ways hopefully will be this general tax that generates additional revenue that could be allocated to us.
Yeah, Nick?
So I really like this idea of having a climate action fund that would be, within that yellow portion of the pie. I think we need to come up with a budget, whatever it is, and using the tools that you guys have outlined, but some of it will be coming from tax revenues. Some of it will come out of general fund. Some of it, I liked also the idea of fees. Now I know those have to be justified, but as Max mentions, the justification is motivation of having people do things. The other thing is, the incentives aren't giving away free stuff. It's just incentivizing people, giving information and providing a little bit of a rebate or something. And I think there are ways to generate that. So if we have an actual, if we say there's this location where fees and revenue and stuff land, and here's how we're going to distribute it, it almost forces us to create a budget that has to, sustain itself. Not that we're just make a big slice of money and say, city, give us this out of the general fund.
I just want to note real quick, it sounds like we're moving from questions to discussion, so we might want to do public comment. We do have a hand up.
Good point. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Have the
Yeah, I'll let Preston talk now.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all. First, I think I owe an apology to staff because the message that ACAC sent to the committee presumed that you wouldn't be able to take action on this tonight, it being a presentation and based on some other information. However, right here we see that this presentation does allow making a recommendation. So I apologize for the breathiness, which I'm experiencing right now, perhaps, with which that was received, or sent, I should say. Going to the council meeting, I didn't come away as sanguine about the council pursuing the ACAC model. Now, I tend to a little more pessimistic, so you can take that into account. But from my perspective, the ACAC model got rescued almost from the jaws of oblivion towards the end of the meeting, with the mayor asking staff to bring back a comparison of revenue under the all utilities taxed at the same rate approach and the ACAC approach. On the ACAC approach, the argument for not raising telecommunications is that, as we're seeing now, telecommunications actually save more resources than they utilize. They're allowing for the current, well, what we're doing here, not having to drive to City Hall for those who might drive there. It's interesting on the water because the mayor called me, I don't know, early this year and said, is there anything we're not taxing that other cities are taxing? Knowing that I'm a bit of a maven on this. And I said, well, water. Little did I know I was dealing with live ammo, and here we are, the proposal to tax water. I would, from my perspective, a narrative that seemed to be shared among at least two council members throughout the discussion of the various tax measures was, well, if we make it complicated, then the voters won't vote for it. So we need to keep it dead simple. This first came up in response to the property transfer tax, which I was pushing for a tiered tax rate, which Berkeley and Oakland and various other cities have, meaning it's a lower percentage on lower value properties. And the council's response was, no, we need to keep it simple for the voters, which I found derogatory of the Albany voters. We have the most educated electorate in the county. But I let you know, if you want to push for this, you need to be prepared to push against that narrative. You need to be prepared to push hard, and I hope you will make a recommendation to recommend the model that ACAC has proposed or something like it as you see fit. I also recommend taking the soda tax approach, which is, it is a general tax, but like the soda tax, there is a required mechanism, annual mechanism in there for the council to take considered recommendations from the Climate Action Committee and hold a study session.
All right, Preston, that's
So thank you very, yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Unless there's no, oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
I like the idea of increasing the utility tax on water because one of the things we're not really addressing is the issue of drought that's going to just continue and get worse. And we should be encouraging people to use less water, and their taxes, will go down if they do. So I think that's a good thing to have included.
Any other comments from the public? Anybody else waiting there? Okay. We should probably wrap this part up. We've got a couple other presentations that are going to probably have some discussion as well. Any other comments that people want to make on this part of it, the funding? Any questions or comments?
I guess the question I have is if we want to make a recommending motion
right,
to back up from us to the city council, should we wait till we get under, I think this is also going to be touched on under or might be touched on under the green building and incentives portion. I would prefer to do it now if we have the opportunity, or can we not do it now because we're in a presentation phase?
I think it's fine to do it now. And it makes sense if it's aligned with this agenda item.
Yeah. Okay, so what I would want to do is make a motion that we just forward the explanation and clarification about and adopt the ACAC recommendations to the City Council on the UUT tax and forward that on with our Climate Action Committee recommendation that they put this into effect.
I second that.
Okay, I'm going to go through a roll call vote. Sorry, I'm just taking my notes on the motion. Okay. All right, just like we did before, we'll do a roll call vote. Committee Member Choi?
Aye.
Committee Member Cooper? Committee Member Peterson?
Aye.
Committee Member Way?
Aye.
Chair Larson?
aye.
And I just want to confirm that we're still missing Vice Chair Martin and Committee Member Breeding because I didn't call them. Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you.
All right, thanks Claire for the update. That was really good, informative, and we got a resolution or a motion out of it. So nice. All right, so the next is presentation from staff on the electric vehicle action plan and discussion. So I think, is that Bianca?
Yep. We'll just wait for Claire to share her slides. Okay, so Yeah, so I'll be giving an update on behalf of the electric vehicle subcommittee. So the EV Action Plan subcommittee consists of Chair Larson, Vice Chair Martin, and committee member Peterson. And so we've met 3 times to discuss the outline and action items within the EV Action Plan. And this is an update on the work for the plan that we have so far. Next slide. So yeah, I wanted to provide some context for the plan that we're creating. So the plan aims to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, and that represents the largest source of municipal emissions at 56%. And the EV Action Plan will supplement the active transportation plan. So as a city, we're still prioritizing alternative modes of transportation. We recognize that first and foremost, personal vehicle use should be minimized. And so the EV Action Plan will also prioritize shared electric transportation, including e-bikes and electrified public transport too. And for cases where someone does need to use a personal vehicle, this plan aims to support the switch from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles and provide the necessary infrastructure to do so as well. Next slide. So I wanted to give a general outline for the plan that we have so far. So the plan will establish a goal for the rate of EV adoption by a certain date, and we'll be getting into that a little bit later in this presentation. It will also include a map of high priority EV charging locations and the types of charging stations for each location. And to accompany that map, we'll also have a list of considerations for charging locations and types of chargers. So namely, that will include, in terms of locations, prioritizing multifamily developments and denser business areas. And the plan will also include a prioritized action item list. As I'll talk about in a minute, the action items that we've come up with can be broken down into 3 categories: outreach and education, actions to increase charging infrastructure in the city, and regional collaboration efforts. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, these are just some of the main actions highlighted under the outreach and education section. So that includes overall creating a public outreach campaign for EVs. As we mentioned before, we've got an intern that will be working on creating a electrification hub and a guide to help residents and community members navigate EV charging and electrification as a whole in the city. And it will also include updating guidance materials at City Hall for installation of EV chargers. Next slide. And these are some of the main proposed actions in the EV Action Plan to increase charging infrastructure. And we've divided it here by measures that are meant to target community adoption and use of EVs, as well as those that the city is going to do to increase its own EV use. So I can just go through some quickly here. So as I mentioned before, we want to electrify shared transportation with priorities towards multifamily housing and business districts, creating an ordinance to allow on-street EV charging, considering electric mobility planning in streetscape or construction projects, increasing EV charging requirements in new construction, and supporting residential EV charging by encouraging panel upgrades. And on the municipal side of things, the plan will include measures to create an EV fleet schedule and increase charging stations at city facilities as well. And for regional partnerships, we will be partnering, or the plan will include measures to partner with EBCE to provide incentives for private charging infrastructure. We'll also, some of our other proposed measures includes working regionally on training programs for EV maintenance and repair to kind of promote EV workforce development, as well as connecting underserved communities with electric mobility programs. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, those are just a broad overview of some of the high priority action items that we've identified. So I've included here a list of some of the goals of various California cities' EV action plans, just for some context, because we will be discussing a little bit about the goal in this plan today. As you can see here, there's kind of a variety of ways that cities have determined EV adoption goals. So some have based it on the state's goal for EV adoption, which is also listed at the top here, while others have based it on their own climate action plan goals. And I also just quickly wanted to point out, as you can see under Berkeley's section, Berkeley did some modeling to figure out the percentage of annual car sales for Berkeley residents that would have to be EVs in order to reach their goals. So as you can see, it is a pretty ambitious target setting there, and just kind of gives some context as to what percentage of EV sales would need to look like in order for us to increase to achieve the goals that we set. Next slide. Great. This is the proposal on the behalf of the subcommittee that they have come up with. So as you can see here, they're recommending that Council adopt a resolution outlining the following EV adoption goals: that 50% of cars in Albany are EVs by 2030, 70% by 2035, and 100% by 2045. Next slide. Great. And so the next steps here are that today will be, the committee as a whole will be discussing EV adoption rate goals. You don't have to make a decision on goals tonight. However, if there is a consensus around that, you can feel free to go ahead. Though, of course, because this is a resolution going to council, council will be the one approving it. And moving forward, the subcommittee will continue to inform development of the plan. As I mentioned, we've met a few times over the past couple months and will continue to do so. And ultimately, staff will develop plan and bring it to committee for recommendation on moving forward with it. So yeah, that's a broad overview here. So I'm happy to go over any questions people have or clarification. I know that was.
Thanks, Bianca. That's very nice. Any questions or comments from committee? Tom?
What was the statistic that we would have to hit with annual sales to go from under 4% currently to 50% in 10 years? What would the annual EV sales have to be? Did you calculate that?
So I haven't calculated that because I'm not quite sure how Berkeley took their measurements into account. I was kind of using, if you wanted to go back to the slide, and also in the memo is listed here, as you can see, I was just kind of using these as a benchmark. I haven't looked into exactly what the annual sales rate in Albany would need to be to achieve this goal. I just wanted to use those numbers for some general context as we consider the goal.
Well, I'll just say I know it's a really interesting perspective. You know, the way Berkeley did that, that's a really good idea. We were looking at this more as a top level, metric that would drive behavior and drive strategies to implementation. So we thought that it was a fairly concrete way of expressing the ultimate goal, and then let the chips fall down below that. But it's a really good question.
The other question I had about this, because we had a discussion about electrical vehicle charging stations in the building subcommittee. Have you considered that outside of residential, including multifamily, that the future trend in batteries are going to be that people would charge at their home? They wouldn't need to go to a grocery store like Sprouts or any kind of retail or street level charging, because people are going to have, within a few years, people will have batteries that can do 300-mile range, that kind of thing. So de-emphasizing the commercial sector and emphasizing more the single family and the rental units that where the landlord's not going to put one in unless we require it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think I've examined the, future predictions for ranges of EVs extensively, but I will say that we definitely in the plan are prioritizing, as I mentioned, multifamily developments, and then incentivizing panel upgrades in home renovations and in general in people's homes as they electrify, so that moving forward, people will have the sufficient electrical capacity to charge their EV at home. But yeah, that is a good point. It's something to look into just as we consider the future of EVs.
I think, Nick, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, just to address what Tom brought up. I mean, no, that's true. So the highest priority would be to try to get people to get charge points at where the place where they live. But, half the people in Albany are renters, and some of them are renting houses, and that would be more straightforward. Others are in multi-family uses. And I think what we were thinking was that this map would have zones that would try to get chargers in places that would be useful to those people if it doesn't happen that they go into apartment buildings. But the need to do this is going to be even bigger, because the whole way EVs work is completely different than the gas station model. If everybody had their own gas pump in their home where they could get gas at half the price that they sold it at gas stations, nobody would go to a gas station. And that's exactly what EVs are. So, and then if you have solar, it's even better. So yeah, it's going to be, it's really tricky, and I'm sure the sales rates are high, but the incentive is going to be that it's very it's so much better than buying gas, and we'll try to play on those incentives and encourage people to switch out. But it's a huge hurdle to try to do. I mean, it's not, you can say these percentages, that's what we need to do to get to what our goals are, but how you implement those, that we still haven't cracked that nut yet. We're still working on that.
Yeah, Tom?
So where I'm coming from is I would think about this as you're building infrastructure. I don't think we should put a burden on the commercial market in Albany, the retail, to require them, use the example of Sprouts or anything like that, where you would require them to add charging stations when that could become obsolete in the short term. So, I think we should be very future focused so that we're prepared for how the technology changes, and we don't have a bunch of stuff lying around that's not going to get used, that we made the local businesses pay for no real.
I'll just throw in my 2 cents as the subcommittee member in relation to that. That was a big part of our discussion, was that it needs to be the residential or the multifamily units, not the commercial, and that's why a lot of it was on like panel upgrades. And so I was happy to see that in the green building part too. We're very aligned on that. So yeah, I think all of us in the subcommittee were aligned on that. Yeah, it's not, nobody's going to go to grocery stores to charge for 20 minutes while they're shopping in the future. That's just not going to be a common model going forward. Does somebody else have a hand up? Max? Yeah, Max.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to comment on the goals of sales versus percentages, like 70% in 2035 versus like 100% of annual sales in 2030. So I do like the sales target also, and I think in general a lot of the upgrades like electric vehicles and maybe even the heat pumps, if we're talking about electric water heat pumps or space heating, electric heat pumps, we're really looking at that 2030 date, because if the average lifetime of these vehicles or appliances in general is like 13 to 15 years, and the average for some of these might be longer in the future. Maybe the average lifetime will go up to 20 years by 2030. Then unless everything is 100% by 2030, you're going to have a lot of kind of stranded assets or stranded equipment, which is either powered by gasoline or by natural gas in 2045. And so you're going to have to deal with that in a radical way. So, you know, this 100% or 80% or 90% of sales by X date, I think is a valuable goal as well. I mean, you could have, you know, kind of both of these, which hopefully are reasonably self-consistent. But I kind of like that idea, because I think that's something that you know, could be tracked potentially, and also it's just to communicate. It's you know, it's a little bit easier for me to grasp, but they're very related, obviously.
I'm going to quickly interrupt and just say we did just get a raised hand, so if we are going into discussion, we might want to get public comment.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, I'll go ahead and let you talk again, Preston.
Thank you. This is your super fan out here in the world. Berkeley has brought forward discussions, and Berkeley has brought forward a funding opportunity that is similar to UUT, but on the fossil fuel transportation side. I'm not bringing this up to suggest pushing for it on this year's ballot, but let you know, put a stake in the ground. So they believe that law allows them to tax gasoline using basically the exact same model that Albany and Berkeley tax sugar sweetened beverages. So while it's not legal, by state law doesn't allow cities to tax gasoline at the pump. It does interestingly provide counties that opportunity, which no county in the state, to my knowledge, has tried that, but it doesn't allow cities to do that. But the way the sugar sweetened beverage tax got around that was by taxing the distributors, I believe, I might be wrong, through the city's business licensing tax authority. And so Berkeley is, I believe they polled on it. I'm not sure. They also polled on the UUT. And my understanding is those results are going to come back in June, and then its council is going to decide. But I just want to let you know that would be a natural, what's called Pagovian tax that could be used to then further subsidize EVs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Preston.
Great, thanks,
And mute you now.
Any other comments or questions from the committee or from the public? Nick?
So one thing that hasn't been included in this was the idea of parking control measures. And I know this is something that I wanted to advocate for sooner rather than later, because it's a real political hot potato and it'll take a while to implement. So if you're gonna, but it's actually a huge way to incentivize people to dump vehicles they don't really need, or to switch vehicles if it costs them less to park an EV than to have a gas-powered one lying around. So that was also another possible part of the plan, which isn't actually reflected in what was presented. So I'm not sure, and we're gonna talk about that more further, but it seemed important for us to just get the high priority bones in place and work towards that.
Right. I mean, Bianca, you can comment. I think what you presented was what we decided were the high priority things that we wanted to start, working on, or present initially that we wanted to start working on. The permit and parking fee thing is, there's more, it's a little bit longer term thing. I hear what you're saying, Nick. I think, Bianca, that it's still on our list of ideas and things to work on, but it's not on the short term, right?
Yeah, I think including them in the list immediately now is not necessarily the best place for them, but I yeah, I don't know if Lizzie or Claire could speak more to this. I don't know too much about it, but in general, I think that's not something that the city's interested in pursuing in the immediate term. So if it were something to happen, it would be more in the longer term.
Sorry, this is the parking management strategies.
Yeah, permitting and things of that.
I think right now we wouldn't be able to pursue it in the short term. I think in the CAAP it's midterm or long term. It's definitely something we would have to collaborate with other departments and divisions and work out a plan for. I don't think we could jump to that right away.
Just to clarify that, my point is specifically because it's such a difficult hurdle, you need to start planning or figuring out how to approach it early. If you start it later, it'll never happen. So, I mean, that's just why I keep bringing it up.
So any other questions or comments? The subcommittee did make the you know, those goals as a possible recommendation to council. Is there any comment on that? Do you feel like you have enough information to consider that, or do you want? Is there any questions or anything on that? Tom?
Yeah, like I said, I think it'd be good to get some more data behind this, because otherwise, irregardless of what the other cities are doing, council's going to look at that 50% and go, boy, that'll never happen. How are we going to get from 4% or 3.6 or whatever it is to, you know, to 50? How are you going to get there? So, you know, I think it's more than just presenting the goal. I think you need the whole proposal and, you know, explaining how you get there. Otherwise, I don't think council would be comfortable just with us saying, here's our goal. If that's what you were saying, maybe I misunderstood what you were proposing.
No, it was the idea of setting a high level goal and making that a sort of a you know, setting that as a goalpost and then letting the actions of the EV action plan drive towards that. What would, short of a full-fledged EV action plan with all tactics and strategies outlined, what, I mean, are you talking about the same sort of vehicle sales metric that Berkeley was having?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know what else they included, but I think, I would think you'd need to show something more than just you have this ambitious goal. And then just assume that the CAAP is going to get us there. There are definitely things in the CAAP to get us there, but they might need a fuller explanation, like, you know, how is Berkeley doing this, or how's some other city doing this? This is how we would do this. It's a combination of these factors that are in the CAAP, you know, like summarizing it for them, rather than just some general thing that the CAAP will address it.
So is it trying to put a little bit more expected results behind the different strategies that were listed?
Yeah, now maybe I'm not recalling the report really well, but if you're saying you're just going to send the council saying, you know, or we pass a resolution saying this is our goal, what I'm getting at is I think we'd need more to that. So maybe you need to explain to me what was your thinking behind what would we vote on or recommend, and what would actually go to council? I think that would help me understand it better.
Nick, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think I agree with Tom. I think, at first I was thinking, oh, it's like drawing a line in the sand just to wake people up to the fact that, hey, these are big. And this kind of reminds me of a post that someone in ACAC made about converting to all electric buildings. And starting right now today, you have to be converting like, 4 per month for the next whatever years immediately. And we're not doing that. And so every day, every week you delay, it gets pushed into even more and more. So these, getting to these goals, even by 2045, are going to be extremely difficult. And that's why I'm thinking, I like what Tom's saying, because we need to have this strategy. And that brings up things like, how do you motivate people? Well, you start charging huge fees on their gas powered cars, so then you have a parking set up where if they're on the street, they either get rid of them or they convert them to EVs. So, I mean, you got to have carrot and stick methodologies to make people respond. You can't just say they're going to go out and replace their car. It's really, I think it's good to have sort of an idea of here's what we need, let people know, here's what we need to do, everybody, if we're realistic about this. But then to make people take that action, I don't think we've solved that completely yet. And it's going to take every tool that we have available, and we can't defer any of them. And we need to start right away.
So it sounds to me like it's do a little bit more work on providing justifications on why we think that we can achieve these goals or how we would go about that. I don't think that we can wait till we have a plan that is like, completely filled out. That's gonna be a working thing for years to come. But so I think we need to get a goal in front of council before then. But I hear what you're saying, that a little bit more justification of how we came to this conclusion would and how we're going to achieve it would be good. I'm sorry. Hold on. Bianca, did you have a comment?
No, I was pretty much just going to say what you had kind of said, Eric, about the stakeholder engagement process for a lot of the work that will have to be done for the plan, all the outreach and figuring out where EV charging stations go, creating that priority map, all that definitely will take time. So I was just, basically what you said about getting something started before the entire thing's finished, but the amount to which the how in depth that proposal is, of course, can change it. So yeah.
Okay. Oops, sorry, I was muted. Nick.
I'll make it quick. And I think what we need to do is get the subcommittee together again and kind of think about the timeline of switching over. I think, you get a little skewed when you're an early adopter, but it was interesting for me. I was perusing, you can actually get the stats on vehicle ownership in our zip code area. And it's amazing how many really old cars are registered in Albany. And, people holding on to, 15, 20-year-old vehicles. So thinking everyone's going to dump those and move, maybe we need to think about it a little bit more. And I also think there must be some sort of, maybe not a consultant, but sources of information on this that maybe can address it a little more in a little more informed manner than us people just trying to work it out off the top of our head.
Max?
Yeah, thanks. I was just gonna make a few comments. One is that in terms of the data collection that we've been talking about, you might consider a simple survey to just try to assess how many vehicles average households have in Albany, and also how many miles do they travel per vehicle. Because if it turns out that like 80% of people drive less than, say, 33 miles per day, then you could already make the argument that, hey, electric vehicles could work for 70% of those people in terms of affordability and charging, even plugging in with a level 1 charger. So that's just a thought. And also with shelter in place, maybe people, you know, there's going to be people who can take a survey because they don't have to commute. But the other thing, in terms of the, you know, the plan that's needed or the presentation to council, I tend to agree with what Tom and Nick were saying in terms of the how, in addition to the what, like what is the target, and then how would that target be achieved over time at mid-decade in 2030. I'm thinking that it might also be possible to have some intermediate form of that thinking in terms of some themes that the subcommittee or the CAC could pursue in terms of, you know, number one, like showing the benefits and the advantages of electrified transportation or electric vehicles in particular, and then also showing the affordability or the, you know, just trying to overcome perceived barriers, like it might be the perception that there's range anxiety, and maybe that'll really be diminished in the near future. And then thirdly, we could also say, hey, we're going to look at measures or policies that can make driving with internal combustion engines more expensive. And that could be in the form of, you know, maybe it's a parking measure program, which would take a while, but, you know, if we start now, maybe we could make that happen, and that could be a kind of a stick. But hopefully you have, you know, set forth these other carrots, but also maybe it's, you know, just pursuing other possibilities like this possibility of a gasoline tax. Maybe it's harmonizing with Berkeley. So I think, you know, just stating and highlighting those themes, and that there are a lot of things to go after, because this really makes a lot of sense, or should make a lot of sense. I think that could kind of build upon what you guys have already done.
All right, great, thanks. That's a lot of good feedback for us. It's we were looking forward to getting the full committee's feedback on that. So in the interest of time, if we're I think that's a good amount of feedback for the EV. We should probably move on to the green building to give that group an opportunity. So we'll move on to the green building presentation. Okay.
All right. So yeah, I'm going to be giving the green building update, a little bit of background about green building, and then also the subcommittee's recommendations that we compiled over 3 meetings recently. Yeah, this is a series of proposals about how we can make our building stock greener, both in new buildings and renovations, through lots of different, different means, both in terms of energy efficiency, but also water and environmental quality and all these other factors as well. So go ahead, next slide, Claire. Thanks. So this is just a little overview. I'm going to talk about some background, refresh everybody on Cal Green and the tiers. And then we're going to go through the recommendations, first with energy efficiency, and then everything else, and then talk about next steps at the end. So this is the Cal Green tiers. So Cal Green is the California Green Building Code. It's mandatory for the entire state of California. And it's split into these 5 sections that are listed here: energy efficiency, planning and design, water efficiency, materials conservation, and environmental quality. And then in addition to that, there are these 2 voluntary tiers, tier 1 and tier 2, that are not required by the state, but a city can require either of the tiers or a mix of measures from within the tiers. So both the tiers have different varieties of measures on each of these different categories. And that's the approach that the subcommittee has taken, is picking measures from both tier 1 and tier 2 that are most fitting for Albany's climate goals. Next slide. So before we dig into the energy efficiency stuff, we have to talk about the CEC, the California Energy Commission. This is the body that sets those mandatory energy efficiency measures or standards. And in order to pass any more strict energy efficiency standards, we have to get the CEC to approve that measure. And in order to approve it, they have to be found cost effective. That's done through a series of studies, basically, that look at specifically, what measures you'd have to use and how much solar you would need and how much that costs for specific types of buildings and climate zones. And so all of the proposed standards that you'll see below are based on those cost effectiveness studies from the CEC. And they're specifically chosen so that the CEC will allow us to require that. And that's just to make sure that cities aren't adopting requirements that are way too strict, that are going to have a really negative impact on the economy, on the housing crisis, that sort of thing. Next slide. And then also our energy design rating. This is another kind of detail thing we have to talk about. This is the method by which energy efficiency is calculated for residential buildings. So for any residential building, they will have an EDR score. And that is on a scale of 0 to 100. 100 being a 2006 IECC compliant home, that's sort of the baseline, and 0 being a zero net energy home. So the lower your EDR score, the more efficient the building. And the CalGreen code and the CEC have set up mandatory EDR scores for all buildings in California. And those can vary based on the type of building, the size, the climate zone, other factors like that. And the subcommittee has decided on more strict EDR requirements. So it basically require buildings to lower their EDR score, making the building more efficient. And the way that that is described is through this term called EDR margin. So for example, here in our little graphic, this mandatory score would be for a single family mixed fuel home. And the mandatory EDR is 23.9 for that kind of building. The subcommittee is proposing that it drop that EDR score to a 13.9, which would be an EDR margin of 10, just 23.9 minus 13.9. So in the next slide, you'll see a series of EDR margins, and that's what we're talking about. It's that amount that the building is becoming more efficient. All right, next slide. So here we have the recommended EDR margins for these different types of residential buildings. You can see we have 10, as I was just talking about, for single family mixed fuel. For single family electric, we have 4.7, multifamily mixed fuel 10.3, and multifamily electric is 0. And obviously there's a lot of numbers on this slide here. What's the main idea behind this is that those mixed fuel buildings have a higher requirement. They have to make the building much more efficient. For the electric buildings, the requirement isn't very strict. For the multifamily electric building, that 0 EDR margin means that it's exactly the same as the mandatory. There's no change. For the single family electric building, there's the 4.7 efficiency margin. And all that means is that that margin is achieved only through increasing the efficiency of the building itself. So that means better insulation, better windows, that sort of thing. Whereas for these mixed fuel buildings, they'll be doing those efficiency measures as well as more solar and also solar storage batteries. And as you can see here on the right, the cost for those mixed fuel buildings is much higher. And they also have a relatively high CO2 reduction. And then at the very bottom here is 0 EDR margin, no change from mandatory, no extra costs, also no extra CO2 reduction. So that's the summary of that, and we can come back to this if you have more questions on it. And this is for non-residential here. Very similar idea, slightly different terminology. It's called compliance margins. It's similar to an EDR margin, but it's done in percentages. So a compliance margin of 0% means that it's just the mandatory level. A compliance margin of 100% means that it's zero net energy. So it's just a percentage calculation of how much better you are than the mandatory level. Right. So again, a higher compliance margin, more efficient building. And you'll see again that we have a similar way of choosing these margins here. The mixed fuel buildings have relatively high compliance margins, and the electric is relatively low. And you'll see the same with the cost and greenhouse gas reductions. We did choose the electric retail building is the same as the mixed fuel, just because the incremental cost was pretty low for a pretty high greenhouse gas reduction. But again, the same sort of thought process is going through on these. Next slide. And then finally, we have solar for non-residential. So the new Cal Green Code requires that all residential buildings have solar now, all new ones, but it doesn't have that same requirement for non-residential. But the subcommittee is proposing that we add that as a requirement. This is a little graphic to explain the way that that would be done. So it requires understanding of this thing called the solar zone. The solar zone is required on all non-residential buildings. It's just a space on the roof that works for solar. It has to be out of the shade. It has to be big enough to fit solar panels. It has to not have any obstructions in it. And it has to be at least 15% of the rooftop area. And this is in the code just to kind of get these buildings ready to eventually put solar panels on. So these spaces for solar exist. They're at least 15% of the roof area. And our proposed measure would require solar panels to actually be installed in this solar zone. So that would mean that at least 15% of the roof area would have solar panels on it for non-residential buildings. We do have an exception to that. If you have a ginormous roof that's all in the sun and very little energy use, we can reduce the amount of solar required just to be equal to the amount of energy being used by the building as well. Next slide. All right, so I know that was kind of a lot of information, but the basic idea behind all of these proposed measures is that for electric buildings, there's an increased efficiency, but the cost that's added is pretty low. Whereas for mixed fuel buildings, we're trying to hit the maximum efficiency that the CEC will allow us. Again, we have to make it cost effective for the CEC to let us create this new requirement, but we've gone up to the maximum in most cases. And that means that there are going to be higher costs, and there's going to be also a greater amount of greenhouse gas reductions for those buildings. So obviously the main goal behind this is to enhance the energy efficiency of all of our building stock and reduce lifetime greenhouse gas emissions, right? You know, making sure that we're making these buildings well when they're being built. And it also has the secondary goal of creating a cost incentive to build electric. Right, there's not very much added cost for an electric building, but there's a high added cost for the mixed fuel building. So rather than creating a gas ban, which is currently in some legal issues, you know, we plan on hoping to move in that direction. But for right now, we can at least create this incentive structure that doesn't have any legal issues behind it. So it'll move more quickly at the moment. All right, next slide. Okay, so that was energy efficiency. This is all of the other aspects of Cal Green now. So this is just a variety of measures that were chosen based on their effectiveness and their importance for Albany climate goals. These are the residential ones. So for EVs, we want to put a requirement that 20% of multifamily parking spaces are EV charging stations. 30% of paving to be permeable, Electric panel upgrades would have to be 200 amp panels and have special spaces in them for future electrification. At least one Energy Star washing machine or dishwasher, low flow kitchen faucets, low carbon concrete, minimum levels of outdoor lighting, and low VOC resilient flooring. And next slide. And these are the non-residential measures. So 12% of parking spaces would be designated for clean air vehicles, outdoor lighting reduced by 10%, 12% reduction in indoor water use using efficient fixtures, low carbon concrete, and again, low VOC resilient flooring. Next slide. So like I said, the reasoning for this is that, first of all, most of these measures are really low cost. The only one that really has much of a cost at all is the EV charging stations. Aside from that, most of them are basically free or really, really not impactful. But they all have pretty high impacts for the most part, not just on, carbon emissions, but on water and all sorts of other things that are important for our CAAP. And you can see below here that we really line them up with the Albany climate goals from the CAAP. So, carbon neutrality, EV readiness, low carbon concrete, water conservation, reducing and slowing runoff, and improving public health. Those are all addressed by this set of measures from KALB. Next slide. So next steps for this is to talk through this proposal and this set of measures that the subcommittee recommends, provide feedback on it, think through if this is, if this sounds like a good set of measures that you guys all feel comfortable with. And then once we've kind of gotten a solid set of measures or maybe more questions, we'll bring it back to talk through with the planning and building staff. And then once we have that all lined up together, we can recommend it to council. And then if it's approved by council, it will go to the CEC for final approval, which will make it law. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we have a question slide. Yes, happy to answer any questions. I know that was a lot of information. I tried to run through it a little bit quickly, but we can definitely go back over any of it if we
All right, thanks Michelle and team. Tom, got a question?
Just a comment, great job. Our subcommittee also met with E. McLeod, who's
Yes.
planning and zoning. So that was an important piece of this because they're also doing the exact same thing. So we wanted to coordinate what we were doing with what they were doing.
I have a question about, this is new building, right? Is there also things that can be done for renovations or existing buildings?
Yes, great question. So some of those measures, non-residential and residential measures, would also apply to renovations. So at the moment, we can't really do the energy efficiency measures for renovations based on CEC issues. But if you look at the memo, there's notes beside each measure that says which ones can be used for renovations as well.
If it's easy, I can read it too, if people would like to hear it.
Yeah, go ahead, Lizzie. That would be helpful.
Okay. And Claire, would you mind going to the residential non-energy measures slide? One forward. There we go. Recommend. For EV charging spaces, the first one there, it would be new construction only. Permeable paving measure would be new constructions and renovations. Electric panel measure would be renovations only. Energy Star measure would be new construction and renovations. Low flow faucets, new construction and renovations. Low carbon concrete, new construction and renovations. Reduced outdoor lighting, new construction and renovations. Low VOC resilient flooring, new construction and renovations. And then next slide. Designated parking, new construction and renovations, reduced outdoor lighting, new construction and renovations, reduced indoor water use, new construction, low carbon concrete, new construction and renovations, low VOC flooring, new construction and renovations.
Nick?
Yeah, thinking back to vehicle charging at home, so the percentage of spaces, if you could just back up the slide again on that, for the multifamily 20%, thinking that most people are is the 20% right out of CalGreen Tier 2, or is it possible to go an even higher number, say 30%?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually higher than the CalGreen Tier 2. Most of these measures are taken from Tier 1 or 2, but this one is actually quite a bit above the tiers, which don't require any actual charging stations. They just require EV-ready spaces. So the Tier 2 requirement was 20% EV-ready, and the subcommittee decided to bump that up to 20% charging stations. But it could be lifted higher potentially.
So had a quick question on follow-on on that. Sorry, Max. So you could have 20% charge stations plus another 10% EV ready. What I'm thinking about is if you get a third of the building covered and it's distributed, people can share off. They can swap off by adjacent parking spaces. And I think that's totally realistic. You don't need to charge every night. So having I mean, I think we need to be smart about this. And maybe 20% would work if it was distributed correctly. I don't know.
Yeah, that was part of the conversation, trying to think about what number made sense. Do you have any comments on that, Max or Tom?
There's also a minimum, I believe it's 1, because we were concerned about, you know, if you have, you know, 3 units, then you don't have to put a space in there unless it's there's a minimum. So that's an additional feature.
Yeah, I think in the discussion, Nick, and the committee, I think it was, you know, we kind of had these starting straw men, so to speak, from Tier 1, Tier 2. So it was a little bit hard for us to judge kind of on the spot. So we you know, had some discussion, but we definitely felt like multifamily was important for equity and also for accessibility reasons. But, you know, it was a little bit hard. I mean, we haven't really kind of worked any calculations or done any additional analysis. It's sort of somewhat our own judgment.
So the other thing would be that a lot multifamily more and more is having fewer parking spaces. You don't have to have 100% coverage of your residential units, right? So anyway, it's something to think about.
Yeah, I think maybe Tom, did you bring that up? I forget who brought that up in our discussion, but we were thinking about how that might be, a factor in thinking through how many.
Yeah, Ian was mentioning that the ordinance was changing. So that was part of our thinking around, let's have at least require 1 space, no matter what's going on there, because it could be a 6-unit building and they only have 4 parking spaces.
Are there any comments or questions from the public?
Okay, I think, is this also Preston? Well, it's
yeah,
phone number
Preston.
ending, okay, phone number ending in 660, so cool. 1 second.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all this information. I look forward to, looking at these slides again in the future to digest it all, but I appreciate you putting it together and presenting it to us. I'm going to relate this back to the UT and to the funding presentation. I appreciate that staff came to the conclusion that local funding would be highly beneficial for matching to boost up incentives and for grant purposes. And the ACAC message didn't really, emphasize much on the spending side, which has been the hang up in the past with the UT. And I think some of what you got here could help motivate that if you made a motion to the council that, for instance, dedicating reserving the electricity and natural gas increase for climate action, with consideration of that it would be flexible because it would be a general tax. So in emergency times like we're in now, it could be diverted at the panel's discretion. But in normal times, it would be reserved for this. I was in a Berkeley Energy Commission meeting. They asked me to present on UUT just like 3 months ago, as they were spinning towards the council, making a recommendation to council there, which council is now pursuing. And that EBCE staff, and I took the opportunity to ask EBCE staff if there was one thing that we could subsidize locally, what would you recommend? And the immediate answer was, that there's very little to no subsidies for panel upgrades. So, and that's a current gap. Now that may change, it's a moving target. I'm not suggesting hardwiring the funding to anything. I think there's good flexibility, but I think it would be useful to send something to the council demonstrating, there is now a building electrification space that is financially, technically, and market viable that didn't exist when the previous recommendations were made and progressively shot down, got closer each time, that now exists and makes a compelling case on the spend side, and that has to happen. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions, comments, or proposals? What was the action? Is this we received the report, or is there going to be, do we want any action on this?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, Lizzie.
Oh, I was just going to say, so we discussed if the committee were to totally feel comfortable and totally understand all this and want to finalize this as the subcommittee recommendation that we'd start vetting through our building and planning folks, we can do that. But if there are questions people still have that they want the subcommittee to reconsider, this is also a time to flag those so that we can go back as a subcommittee and reanalyze those. So I guess to say it again, the two options would be to say the committee agrees as a consensus that this is the packet we want to start really vetting, or there's still questions we have about certain things that we want the subcommittee to reconsider before we start vetting a whole package. Does that make sense?
And Nick?
Yeah, I am just totally impressed by this whole presentation. I think this is excellently done, and the amount of detail that was in the attachments and everything. It's very clear and understood. The one thing I had was just on the EV parking charge points. I think we should keep the momentum going. I mean, we're so shattered with the COVID thing, and things are so herky-jerky, and we just lost 2 months of not being able to meet. And I think moving ahead on this is fine. I'm sure we will get to reiterations at a later date and adjustments, but I feel very comfortable with this. Has been very well thought out.
So I guess I can make a motion, Lizzie, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd make a motion to adopt, I guess, the slide that you have here of our recommendations from this update from the building subcommittee, I'm not sure if it's a recommendation to council, Lizzie, or if it's a recommendation just to move forward with the vetting process or the kind of the more formalized recommendation to the CEC.
Yeah, let me actually, Claire, if that's okay with you, do you have an idea of which would be the best course? We have to go to the vetting process anyway, but what should the motion?
I think you are welcome to pass a motion this evening to recommend to council to adopt this, the green building update, code update, as stated in this presentation. The caveat is that we haven't fully vetted it with planning and building staff yet. So I guess the question is, if we need to make modifications, would you like us to come back? It sort of depends on how substantial those modifications might be. But I think it's fine for you to make a recommendation now, with the understanding that we may end up needing to bring it back to you if something changes, but we may not.
I mean, you may not make changes, or you may not bring it back to us.
We may not, if you make a recommendation tonight and it turns out that we don't need to make any changes, then we wouldn't have to bring it back to you.
I think if we
But there's not, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think if we had to make like substantial changes, we would probably bring it back regardless, just because.
Right.
It's different.
Yeah, there isn't a rush on this because council won't have time to adopt them in June. So we could wait till next month without any issue.
Do you know where the status of the Planning and Zoning Commission is in terms of submitting a recommendation on this?
We haven't discussed that yet.
Well, it sounds like the first step from what you're saying is to take it to the other commissions or committees that would, you know, have be impacted and give feedback. So I'd be up for doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to be in lockstep with planning and zoning, because otherwise that's going to be council's question is, you know,
what do they think of
where
it?
did this come from?
Yeah.
Right. Who are you?
Yeah. All right. So is that our Nick? Yeah.
So do we actually need to make a motion? I mean, can we just direct staff to proceed with next steps and keep us posted? And then if we need to make a motion to put it to city council, we can do it next time.
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
All right. So that sounds like consensus, what we want to do. Yeah, good. All right. All right. Nice job. That was great information. All right. By the agenda, we are done with the regular agenda. Anybody have any future agenda items that they wanted to bring in for next meeting?
Yeah, Eric,
Yeah, Max?
I can try to bring in the student Nina Higazi's thesis that we had discussed earlier this year, but she's in Sweden, but that's something we could target. And if she can't make it, which she may not be able to, I'd be happy to share some of the highlights of her thesis work pertaining to electrification of single-family homes in Albany.
It's funny to think that now she might actually be able to attend our meeting because it's virtual.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Tom?
Can we get a report on the status of the development on the Hill at the next meeting, when you just give us an update about what's going on there?
Yeah, I don't think anything's going on there. I think the status is that nothing's going on there, is my understanding. I think there was a developer that pulled out.
Okay, so nothing further is going on.
From my understanding, nothing's happening. But I'll ask Jeff if there's any updates.
Okay.
And we certainly can provide them when there are.
Okay. Thank you.
Looks like somebody from the public.
Yeah, it looks like we have another comment from Preston here. Okay, Preston, you're on.
Thank you. Probably self-evident, but I would keep UUT on your action part of your agenda, because the city council will make some decisions and you should have the opportunity to react to those and provide further advice towards tuning the final form, because the final form under the typical process comes back in July, the actual full complete language of what's going to be put on the ballot. So you'll still have an opportunity in June to bend that trajectory if you need to. Thank you.
Thanks, Preston.
All right, so Lizzie, did you get that? Okay. All right. Nick?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Lizzie, I'll send you a written portion of what I read. I'll just email it to you, so you don't have to try to transcribe it off the recording.
Sorry, this is for what was discussed earlier.
Proposal.
Our motion for the UUT recommendation to council.
I have the motion written down here. So you'd be sending me the proposal?
Yeah, I think Nick was just saying he could send you the actual written proposal so you didn't have to try to transcribe it off of this. But if you already have it.
I think I have, you can tell me if this is wrong. I have, the ACAC proposal is a utility user tax of 7% on telecommunication, 10% on gas and electric, and 8% on water. Oh, Nick, you're muted.
You're still muted.
Not close, but no cigar. Let me just email it to you. Because I read exactly what this says, and it's slightly, that was close. I think it's 7% on water, because that we weren't changing whatever the city was recommending. And I think they were saying, I can't remember, 7 or 8. Actually, we were saying 7. The city might have been saying 8. We were putting higher on the electric and the gas, keeping the telephone the same, and leaving and putting water at 7, which was the lowest that electrical could go to.
Okay. So,
Nick, do you have a if you provided a table that had the utility and then your tax increase recommendation, that might be really helpful.
So to basically compare it to what was put in the survey versus what ACAC is recommending.
I mean, we could do that piece. It's just having a table of what ACAC is recommending instead of a narrative. I think would be really helpful for communication.
Sure, I'll do that.
If it's easy. Thank you.
We have another comment from Preston.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to offer to, either I can go away. I was just going to offer to put together a table and pass it to Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I always like to be double checked, but I always get some things mixed up, and this way I can blame Preston.
Any other future agenda items? Okay. All right, well, good job, everybody. I think we are adjourned. So we'll see you
That
next
went
time.
really well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Excellent, excellent first Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, staff.
Lizzie and
Great work.
Bianca and